The sun had already slipped behind the tall desert hills when Thomas Avery stepped outside his small wooden cabin. The evening was colder than usual, and a thin layer of frost touched the dry grass around his home. Thomas rubbed his hands together and breathed into them for warmth. He had lived alone for many years and was used to the silence of the desert nights. Still, there were moments like this when the loneliness felt heavier than the cold. He walked around to check the fence, the water trough, and his animals. He did this every evening because it was a habit he had kept for decades. After finishing, he picked up a few pieces of firewood and carried them into the cabin. The quiet was deep, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Just as he closed the door behind him, he heard something strange: soft footsteps outside. It wasn't the heavy step of a wandering animal. It was lighter, hesitant, human. Thomas stopped what he was doing and listened carefully. He heard the sound again, this time closer. Someone was outside in the cold, walking toward his cabin. His heart gave a quick jump, not out of fear but surprise. No one came this far into the desert unless they had a purpose, and at this hour it was even more unusual. He slowly walked toward the door, his boots making a dull thud on the wooden floor. With one deep breath, he unlatched the door and opened it. There, standing at the edge of the small wooden porch, was a young Apache girl. She looked no older than 13 or 14. Her long black hair fell around her shoulders, tangled from the wind. Dust covered her clothes, and her shoes looked worn out from walking long distances. She held her own arms tightly as if trying to keep herself warm. Thomas stared for a moment, taken by surprise. The girl's eyes lifted to meet his, tired but steady. She looked frightened yet determined, as if she had made a difficult decision by coming here. Her voice came out soft, almost trembling, but with a clear sense of need. "Please let me stay with you tonight. I'll help you put the log in the stove." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Thomas pause. In all his years living here, he had never had a child appear at his door asking for shelter. He wasn't sure what to say. He had questions, many questions, but he could see from her face that she had been walking in the cold for a long time. Her lips were dry, and her hands were shaking. "Come inside," Thomas finally said, moving aside so she could enter. His voice was gentle, though a little unsure. The girl stepped into the cabin quietly, as if afraid of disturbing the small space. Inside, the warm glow from the stove lit the room. It wasn't much. A table, 2 chairs, a small bed in the corner, and shelves lined with simple necessities. The place smelled of burning wood and old books. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe, warm, and quiet. The girl walked toward the stove and held her hands out to the heat, trying to warm her fingers. Thomas watched her carefully, noticing the way she kept her eyes lowered, as though unsure if she was allowed to speak. "What's your name?" Thomas asked softly. She answered without lifting her head. "Nayeli." "That's a pretty name," he said. "I'm Thomas." When she didn't speak further, he added, "You look tired." "Were you walking for a long time?" Nayeli nodded slowly. "Since yesterday." Thomas felt a heavy pull in his chest. Yesterday. That meant she had been out here in the open desert for more than a night. The cold alone could harm someone so young, and the desert was not a safe place for any traveler without guidance. He reached for the chair and pulled it closer to the stove. "Sit down. Warm yourself." Nayeli sat quietly, her small frame still trembling from the cold. Thomas brought a blanket from the bed and gently placed it around her shoulders. She gripped it tightly, almost as if she feared it would be taken away. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She shook her head at first, perhaps out of shyness, but her stomach growled loudly enough to give away the truth. Thomas gave a small, gentle smile and went to the shelf. He took out a loaf of bread, some dried fruit, and a metal cup of warm tea he had made earlier. Without saying much, he placed the food on the table in front of her. Nayeli looked at the meal with gratitude, but also with hesitation. "Thank you," she whispered before taking a small bite. As she ate, Thomas quietly added more wood to the stove. The flames rose, spreading a stronger warmth through the cabin. He kept stealing glances at Nayeli, trying to understand her situation. She looked so young to be out here alone, and her expression carried a mix of fear, exhaustion, and quiet bravery. He didn't want to overwhelm her with too many questions too soon. So he asked, gently, "How did you find my cabin?" She paused, swallowed slowly, and said, "I saw smoke from far away. I followed it." Thomas nodded. It made sense. Smoke was often the only sign of human life in this area. He wondered what had happened to make her wander so far from home. Outside, the wind blew harder, tapping softly against the cabin walls. Thomas closed the shutters tightly and checked the door again, just to make sure the cold wouldn't find its way in. For a long minute, neither of them spoke. The crackling of the stove filled the silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence, more like the quiet that comes when two strangers are trying to understand each other. Nayeli finished eating and looked up at Thomas for the first time since entering his home. Her eyes were dark and deep, filled with a seriousness beyond her age. "Thank you for letting me stay," she said softly. "You're safe here," Thomas replied. "You can rest tonight." The girl nodded again. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, as if she finally felt she could breathe. Thomas settled into his chair, still watching her with concern. He didn't know her story yet, where she came from, who she belonged to, or what danger she might be escaping. But he could see clearly that she needed help, and turning her away would have been something he could never live with. As the fire warmed the small cabin and the night deepened outside, Thomas realized something unexpected. Even though he had lived alone for years, having another person in the cabin didn't feel uncomfortable. In fact, the cabin felt a little less empty, a little more alive, with this quiet, determined girl sitting near the stove. And as the wind howled outside, Thomas sensed that this night, which had started like any other, was about to become a part of a much bigger story, one neither of them could yet see. The fire in the stove crackled softly, filling the cabin with a warm glow. Nayeli sat close to it, still wrapped in the blanket Thomas had given her. Her face looked calmer now, but her eyes still carried a quiet fear, the kind that appears when someone has gone through more than they can explain. Thomas noticed it, and though he wanted to ask questions, he did not want to scare her or make her uncomfortable. He sat down across from her at the small wooden table, resting his hands on the smooth surface. The night outside was getting colder, and the wind made soft whistling sounds as it passed through the cracks in the window frame. Inside, however, everything felt safe. Silent, but safe. After a long moment, Thomas spoke in a gentle voice. "If you want to tell me anything, I will listen. If not, that is also all right." Nayeli nodded slowly but didn't speak. She looked down at the blanket, playing with its edges between her fingers. Thomas could see that her thoughts were heavy. She was trying to decide how much she should say and how much she should keep to herself. To make her feel less pressured, Thomas stood up and walked over to the shelf. "I'm going to make a little more tea," he said. "It helps on cold nights." He said it casually, giving her space to think. As the kettle warmed, he glanced toward her. She was still sitting quietly, her eyes fixed on the floor. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the quiet that wraps around two strangers who are learning to trust each other. When the tea was ready, Thomas poured some into a cup and placed it gently in front of her. "Here, it'll help warm you up." Nayeli wrapped her hands around the cup, not drinking yet, just absorbing the warmth. She kept her head low as she murmured, "Thank you." "You're welcome," Thomas replied. For several minutes, the only sound was the crackling fire and the wind outside. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, the girl lifted her head. "I didn't mean to come here," she said softly. "I didn't plan it." Thomas nodded, encouraging her without pushing. "I understand. I didn't know where else to go," she continued. She paused again, her breath shaking slightly as she spoke. "I walked for a long time. I thought the cold would make me fall asleep outside. I was scared." Thomas's heart tightened a little. He had seen many travelers before, but never a child wandering alone in such harsh weather. "You did the right thing coming here," he said quietly. "Anyone would have helped you." Nayeli shook her head gently. "Not everyone." Her voice was barely above a whisper. It carried memories that Thomas knew were painful, even if she didn't say them aloud. Thomas took a seat again, keeping his voice soft. "Would you like to tell me where you were going?" Nayeli's eyes moved to the fire. She stared at the flames as if they were easier to speak to than a person. "I wasn't going anywhere," she replied. "I was trying to find my family again." "You got separated?" Thomas asked. She nodded, pressing her lips together tightly. Her small hands gripped the cup as if holding on to it gave her courage. "We were traveling," she said slowly. "My grandmother is sick. Some of my relatives were taking me with them to find someone who could help, but on the way, things became confusing." She hesitated, searching for the right words. There were too many paths, too many voices. And then I lost them. Her voice cracked just a little, the first sign of emotion she had allowed to escape. Thomas felt a deep sympathy for her. The desert was no place for a child to be wandering, especially not alone, and especially not at night. "Did you try to follow them?" he asked carefully. "Yes." She nodded. "I tried. I walked for hours, but the tracks became hard to see when the wind blew, and I couldn't hear anyone calling anymore." Her eyes softened with sadness. "I didn't know if I was walking the right way or not." "You were brave to keep going," Thomas said. Nayeli looked down again. "I just didn't want to stop. If I stopped, I thought something bad might happen." Thomas understood this feeling very well. Many years ago, when he was younger, he had faced moments where stopping meant fear would catch up with him. He saw the same determination in this young girl. "Why didn't you rest until you reached the cabin?" he asked gently. "I did," she said. "I rested twice, but the ground was too cold, and I was afraid that if I slept too long, I wouldn't wake up." She lifted her cup and finally took a sip of the warm tea. "Then I saw smoke, far away. I thought maybe it was someone who would help." Thomas took a deep breath. The idea of her wandering alone through the freezing desert made him uneasy. What if she had walked in a different direction? What if she had never seen the smoke from his chimney? Thinking about it made him shiver despite the warmth of the fire. "You're safe now," he repeated softly. Nayeli nodded again, but her eyes didn't fully relax. She was grateful, but worry still sat on her shoulders. Thomas tried a different approach. "Would you like to sleep for a while? You look very tired." She hesitated. "Can I help first?" she asked. "Help?" Thomas asked, surprised. "Yes," she said quietly. "I said I would help you put the log in the stove. I can still do it." Her words made him smile, a small but genuine smile. "You already helped more than enough by letting me know you needed a place to stay. The stove is fine." But Nayeli shook her head lightly. "I want to help. I don't want to be trouble." "You're not trouble," Thomas said gently. "Not at all." She seemed unsure, but she accepted his words. Taking her time, she stood up from her chair and walked closer to the stove. She picked up a small log with careful hands and placed it inside, pushing it gently until it rested in the right spot. She moved slowly, respectfully, as if the fire were something alive that deserved patience. Thomas watched her silently. Even exhausted, she worked with quiet grace. She didn't complain, didn't ask for anything, didn't show fear unless she couldn't hide it. There was something strong in her spirit, something steady and dignified. After placing the log, she stepped back and returned to her seat. "Now may I rest?" she asked politely. Thomas nodded. "Yes, of course." He prepared a small bed for her near the stove. It wasn't much, just extra blankets and a soft pillow, but it was warm and safe. Nayeli lay down slowly, still wrapped in the blanket, still holding a bit of the warmth from the tea. The firelight flickered across her face, softening her expression. Her eyes began to close, but she opened them again for a moment to look at Thomas. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas nodded gently. "Sleep. We'll talk more in the morning." Nayeli closed her eyes, and within minutes she was asleep, breathing softly and deeply. The kind of sleep that comes only when a person finally feels safe after a long, difficult journey. Thomas sat nearby for a while, watching the fire and listening to the quiet breathing of the girl who had appeared at his door like a lost bird seeking shelter. He felt a strange sense of responsibility wash over him, something he hadn't felt in many years. Outside, the night grew colder, but inside the cabin, a small piece of warmth, both from the stove and from the unexpected company, filled the space. And as Thomas finally leaned back in his chair, he knew one thing clearly. This wasn't just a simple visit. Something deeper was unfolding, something that would change the days to come. The morning came slowly, with the soft light of dawn slipping through the small cabin window. Thomas opened his eyes to the gentle glow and the steady sound of the fire still burning. For a moment, he forgot that someone else was inside with him. He had spent so many years alone that waking up to another person's presence felt unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. Then he turned his head and remembered. Nayeli was sleeping on the small bed he had prepared for her near the stove. She was curled up under the blankets, her breathing slow and peaceful. The exhaustion from the long journey still showed on her face, but at least she looked safe and warm now. Thomas let her sleep a little longer. She needed rest more than anything. He quietly got up, careful not to make much noise. He put on his old coat and stepped outside to check on the animals before the day fully started. The cold air hit his face sharply, but it wasn't as harsh as the night before. The sky had a pale pink color, and a few thin clouds drifted lazily above the desert. As he fed the chickens and checked the water barrel, Thomas kept thinking about Nayeli's story. A young girl wandering alone in the desert, separated from her family, with only a small hope guiding her steps. It made him wonder what else she hadn't told him yet. He could tell she was still holding back parts of her story, not out of dishonesty, but out of fear or uncertainty. He walked back inside, closing the door behind him. The warmth from the stove welcomed him, wrapping around him like a blanket. Nayeli was still asleep, but she stirred when she heard him come in. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking at the soft light. "Good morning," Thomas said gently. "Good morning," she replied, her voice still sleepy. "How did you sleep?" he asked. She sat up a little, pulling the blanket closer. "Better than I have in many nights," she said softly. Thomas smiled, happy to know she felt safe. "Good. I made some warm water if you want to wash your face. It might help you wake up." Nayeli nodded. "Thank you," she said, always polite, always gentle. While she washed up, Thomas prepared some simple breakfast, warm porridge with a little honey and a piece of soft bread. When she returned to the table, she looked more awake, though the sadness in her eyes still lingered. They ate quietly for a few minutes, neither of them rushing. Thomas didn't want to push her to talk, but he hoped she would open up on her own. After taking a few bites, Nayeli set her spoon down and looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "Thomas," she began quietly, "may I tell you something?" "Of course," he replied. "You can tell me anything." She took a slow breath, gathering her courage. "Last night, you asked if I wanted to tell you how I got separated from my family." She paused, her fingers tightening slightly around the bowl. "I didn't tell everything," Thomas nodded softly. "I know. And that's all right. You can tell me only what you feel ready to share." Nayeli looked relieved at his gentle answer. It gave her enough comfort to continue. "When we were traveling," she said, "my grandmother was very sick. She couldn't walk far, so my uncles were carrying her. We were trying to reach someone who could help, someone who knows old medicines." Her eyes softened with worry as she remembered. "But the journey was long, and everyone in my family was tired." She paused again, her voice softening even more. "We reached a place where the wind was strong, and the paths were confusing. My uncle told me to stay close, but I couldn't keep up. They walked faster because they were worried about my grandmother. I called out, but the wind took my voice away." She looked down at her hands. "And then they were gone." Thomas felt a heavy sadness in his chest. It was easy to imagine the fear she must have felt. The desert winds could swallow a voice completely. Even an adult could get lost out here. For a child, it must have been terrifying. "You must have been very scared," he said quietly. Nayeli nodded without speaking. "What did you do next?" he asked gently. "I tried to follow their footprints," she said. "But the wind erased them. I walked and walked, hoping I would hear them again. When the sun went down, I didn't know where I was anymore." A small tremble touched her voice. "I thought maybe they went back another way, or maybe they were calling for me, but I couldn't hear." Thomas listened carefully. Every detail she shared helped him understand her situation more clearly. "You did your best," he said. "Anyone could have lost the trail in that wind." Nayeli lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze. "I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to cry. I thought crying would make me weak. So I just kept walking." She swallowed. "I was afraid my grandmother would worry if she woke up and didn't see me." Her worry wasn't for herself. It was for her grandmother. That told Thomas a lot about her heart. "You're strong," Thomas said sincerely. "Stronger than most people I've known." Her eyes softened with a hint of gratitude. "I just didn't want to be left behind." "You weren't left behind on purpose," he reassured her. "Your family must be very worried about you right now." Nayeli lowered her eyes again. "I know." Thomas took a slow breath. Now that she was talking more freely, he wanted to help her figure out what to do next. "Do you remember which direction they were traveling?" he asked. She nodded. "Toward the tall hills with the red rocks. There is a healer's home there." Thomas knew the place she meant. It was several miles away, but reachable if they left early. He thought carefully before speaking. "I can take you there," he said. "We can look for your family." Nayeli's eyes widened slightly. "You would do that?" "Of course," Thomas answered. "You shouldn't walk alone again. It's not safe." She looked relieved, but also a little nervous. "What if they moved? What if they're not there anymore?" Thomas hesitated for a moment. "Then we will ask around. We will keep looking until we find them. You won't be alone." Nayeli nodded slowly, absorbing his words. She didn't smile, but something in her expression softened, like a small weight had been lifted from her heart. After breakfast, Thomas began preparing for the journey. He checked his old lantern, filled his water canteen, and made sure he had enough food for both of them. Nayeli helped in her own quiet way, folding blankets, handing him supplies, sweeping the floor even though he told her she didn't need to. She wasn't the type to sit still while others worked. Her sense of responsibility showed in every small action. As they worked, Thomas asked gently, "Is there anything else you want to tell me before we leave?" Nayeli hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the blanket she was folding. Then she lifted her eyes, filled with honesty. "There is one more thing," she said softly. "I wasn't just scared of getting lost. I was scared because I know my grandmother's condition is serious." She looked down. "If something happens to her before I find them, I don't know what I will do." Thomas felt a deep ache in his heart. He stepped closer and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We'll find them," he said firmly. "We'll go as soon as you're ready." Nayeli nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and fear. As she helped him place the last log in the stove before leaving, the fire flickered brightly, sending warm light across the cabin. It felt like a quiet promise, one that held the beginning of a new journey, a journey back toward her family, a journey toward answers and maybe healing. And for the first time since she arrived, Nayeli whispered a small wish into the warm glow of the room. "I hope today brings us luck." Thomas nodded. "It will," he said. "We'll make sure of it." The sun had barely risen when Thomas and Nayeli stepped outside the cabin to begin their journey. The morning air was cold, but not as sharp as the night before. It carried the smell of dry earth and distant sagebrush. A soft wind brushed past them as if urging them forward. Nayeli wrapped the blanket tightly around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the hills in the far distance, the direction where she believed her family had gone. Thomas checked the straps on his small bag and made sure the canteen was secure. He turned to Nayeli and gave a gentle nod. "Ready?" She nodded, though her face held a mixture of hope and nervousness. "Yes." They began walking. The desert stretched out before them, wide and open. Small rocks crunched beneath their feet, and the early sunlight painted long shadows on the ground. Thomas kept a steady pace, making sure Nayeli could keep up without getting too tired. She walked quietly beside him, her steps small but determined. For the first hour, they didn't speak much. The quiet gave Nayeli time to gather her thoughts, and it gave Thomas time to think about how to guide her safely. Every now and then, he glanced at her to make sure she was all right. She kept her eyes on the path, her face calm but focused. After a while, Thomas broke the silence. "If you get tired, tell me. We can stop whenever you need." Nayeli shook her head. "I'm fine. I can walk." He smiled softly. "I know you can, but walking with someone is different than walking alone. You don't have to push yourself so hard now." His gentle voice relaxed her a little. "I'll tell you if I need to rest," she said. They continued onward. The land slowly changed as they walked. The ground sloped upward, and clusters of tall, dry grass appeared here and there. The hills ahead looked closer now, glowing softly under the sun. Thomas recognized the area. He had traveled this way many times in his younger years. He knew the healer's home wasn't far from the valley on the other side. As they approached a stretch of rocky ground, Thomas slowed down. "Watch your step here," he warned. "Some of these rocks are loose." Nayeli nodded and followed carefully. She stepped lightly, testing each rock before fully placing her foot on it. Thomas watched her with quiet admiration. Even though she was young, she moved with caution and awareness, as if she had learned from the land itself. After crossing the rocky stretch, they reached a small rise where the view opened wider. Thomas stopped and looked out, scanning the distant hills. He shaded his eyes with his hand. "If your family passed through here," he said, "they might have stopped by the stream up ahead. It's the only water in this area." Nayeli looked hopeful. "Maybe they waited there." "Maybe," Thomas said. We'll check. They walked for another hour before reaching the stream. Though small, it flowed gently between smooth stones, sparkling under the sunlight. Nayeli rushed forward and knelt near the water, touching it with her fingertips, as if testing whether the place was familiar. Do you see anything? Thomas asked. She looked around carefully. She examined the ground, the grass, and the stones. For a moment, her eyes brightened. There are footprints, she said. Thomas walked closer and crouched beside her. The footprints were faint but visible. Not fresh, but not too old either. A trail of footsteps leading away from the stream toward the hills. This looks promising, Thomas said. Your family was likely here. Nayeli's eyes filled with cautious hope. We're close, aren't we? We're getting there, Thomas replied. They followed the trail, but as the sun climbed higher, the air grew warmer and the shadows shorter. The path became steep, and Nayeli's breathing grew heavier. She tried to hide her tiredness, but Thomas noticed. Let's rest for a moment, he said. She hesitated. But what if they're just ahead? What if we lose time? We won't, Thomas assured her. You'll walk better if you rest. Even the strongest people stop sometimes. She finally agreed and sat on a flat rock. Thomas gave her water and a small piece of bread. She ate quietly, looking out over the valley below. Thomas, she said softly, do you think they're all right? Yes, he answered without hesitation. Your family is strong. They know the land, and they would never stop looking for you. Nayeli took a small breath. I hope I reach them in time. Thomas didn't push her to explain. He understood the worry in her voice. He could see how deeply she cared for her grandmother and how much finding her family mattered. After resting, they continued the climb. The hills around them were tall and red, with long cracks running down their sides like old stories etched into stone. The path narrowed, forcing them to walk close together. Thomas walked slightly ahead, clearing loose stones so Nayeli wouldn't trip. As they reached a ridge, the wind grew stronger. Nayeli's hair blew around her face, but she kept walking. Thomas admired her courage. She didn't complain, didn't ask to stop again. She simply followed, trusting him completely. When they reached the top of the ridge, Thomas paused. Below them lay a quiet valley surrounded by red hills. In the center stood a small wooden home with smoke rising gently from its chimney. Nayeli gasped softly. That's the healer's place, she whispered. Thomas nodded. It is. Her eyes widened with new hope. Do you think my family is there? We'll find out, Thomas said. They began to descend the hill, taking careful steps. As they walked, Nayeli's heartbeat quickened. Her hands trembled slightly. She kept her eyes fixed on the small home as if afraid it might disappear. When they reached the valley floor, Thomas noticed something. Footprints around the healer's home. Several of them, he pointed. Looks like people were here recently. Nayeli hurried forward, though still cautious. She approached the door and looked back at Thomas, waiting for him to knock. He stepped beside her and knocked gently. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Nayeli's expression filled with uncertainty. Are they gone? Thomas listened carefully. Let me check around. He walked around the small house. Near the back, he found something. Fresh ashes near a small fire pit, and a few pieces of cloth similar to the ones Nayeli wore. Come here, he called softly. Nayeli ran to his side. When she saw the cloth, her eyes widened. This is from my cousin's clothing, she said, touching it gently. Thomas nodded. They were here. But they left? Nayeli asked, her voice trembling slightly. Probably this morning, Thomas said, before we arrived. Nayeli looked in the direction of the hills. Where would they go next? Thomas studied the ground and the tracks. He noticed the path leading toward a narrow canyon. "They went that way," he said. "Not far ahead." Nayeli's heart lifted with hope. "Then we can catch up." Thomas gave her a reassuring nod. "Yes, we can." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Let's keep going. I don't want to stop now." Thomas admired her determination. "We won't stop," he said. "We're close." They followed the trail toward the canyon. The path was tight, with tall red stone walls rising on both sides. The shadows inside were cool and comforting, and a soft echo followed their footsteps. Nayeli moved quickly now, her fear replaced by a strong sense of purpose. She looked ahead with shining eyes, knowing that every step brought her closer to her family. Thomas kept up with her pace. And for the first time since she arrived at his cabin, he saw something new on her face. Not fear, not worry, but real hope. It was a hope strong enough to guide her through the canyon and toward whatever waited beyond it. And as they continued walking, both of them sensed the same thing. They were no longer searching without direction. They were finally moving toward reunion, and perhaps toward healing as well. The first light of dawn slowly touched the desert, spreading a soft golden glow across the land. The long night had finally ended, and Thomas stood outside his cabin with the old lantern in his hand, checking the wick one more time. The cold morning air brushed against his face, but he hardly noticed it. His mind was too focused on the journey ahead. Inside the cabin, Nayeli wrapped the blanket around her shoulders as she adjusted her shoes. She looked small and tired, but her eyes carried a quiet strength. Thomas watched her silently for a moment. In the few hours they had known each other, he had come to respect the calm courage she showed. Not once had she complained about the cold, the fear, or the loneliness she must have felt. Instead, she had helped him with the cabin chores as if she had lived there for years. There was something about her that reminded him of how strong young hearts could be. "Ready?" Thomas asked softly. Nayeli nodded with a gentle smile. "Yes. Thank you for helping me." Her voice was polite, full of gratitude. Thomas simply nodded and opened the cabin door wider. They stepped outside together into the quiet morning, leaving behind the warm cabin that had protected them through the long night. Frost covered the ground in a thin layer, shining under the early sunlight. The sky was a pale mix of pink and orange, slowly waking with the day. Thomas handed the lantern to Nayeli. "Hold this steady. The path is easier to follow when the light hits the ground." She held it carefully, the metal frame still warm from earlier use. They began to walk down the narrow dirt path that stretched past the cabin and toward the open land. Their footsteps made soft crunching sounds on the frosty ground. The desert looked peaceful in the morning, but the cold was sharp, and Thomas made sure to walk beside her so she would feel safe. For a while, they moved in silence. Nayeli looked around, trying to recognize the land, though everything looked slightly different than she remembered. The wind carried the smell of dry earth and distant pine trees. Birds slowly began to wake, their faint sounds traveling through the still air. After some time, Nayeli spoke softly. "I didn't think I would reach anyone last night." Thomas looked down at her. "The night can be frightening out here. You were brave to keep walking." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched the path under her feet, thinking deeply. "I kept hoping there would be a light somewhere," she said finally. "When I saw smoke from your chimney, I felt hope again." Thomas gave a small smile. "I'm glad you found my cabin. Not everyone comes this way." She looked up at him. "Were you afraid to open the door?" He chuckled lightly. "A little. When you live alone, you start to worry about unexpected visitors, but you didn't look dangerous, just cold and tired." Nayeli nodded slowly. I was very tired. I didn't want to sleep outside. Thomas's expression softened. He could not imagine a child spending the night alone in the freezing desert. He felt grateful she had reached his door in time. They continued walking. The land began to change gently as they approached the area where the Apache trails passed. Small bushes grew closer together, and the soft hills in the distance seemed more familiar to Nayeli. She looked ahead with growing confidence. "There," she said, pointing toward a narrow, winding trail. "I think that is the way to my village." Thomas followed her finger and saw the faint path stretching toward the hills. "If that's the one, we'll follow it." They turned onto the trail, and the desert air grew slightly warmer as the sun rose higher. Nayeli walked with a little more speed now, sensing she was getting closer to home. Thomas noticed the change and felt relieved. The journey was long, but they were moving steadily. After nearly an hour of walking, they heard distant sounds, soft voices carried by the wind. Nayeli slowed down, listening carefully. Her eyes widened. "I know those voices," she whispered. Thomas straightened. "Your family?" She nodded quickly. "Yes. They must be nearby." They continued forward, and soon figures appeared in the distance, several adults and a few children. They seemed to be searching the area, scanning the land with worried eyes. When one of the women spotted Nayeli, she let out a cry of relief. "Nayeli!" the woman shouted, running toward her. Nayeli stepped forward just as her relatives rushed over. The woman, who appeared to be Nayeli's aunt, wrapped her arms around her, holding her tightly. Other family members surrounded her, speaking at once, asking if she was hurt, if she was cold, if she had eaten. Nayeli pointed at Thomas. "He helped me. I stayed at his cabin last night." The family turned to Thomas, their expressions softened with gratitude. One of the men walked up to him and held out his hand. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "She is very important to us." Thomas shook his hand gently. "I'm glad she found me. She needed a warm place. I just did what anyone should do." The man nodded with respect. "Still, we are grateful." Nayeli stepped forward again, her small hands holding the lantern she no longer needed. She looked up at Thomas with a calm, warm expression. "Thank you for everything, for the food, the blanket, and for walking with me." Thomas felt a slow warmth spread through his chest. There was something deeply comforting about her gratitude, simple, pure, and honest. "You take care of yourself," he said, "and stay close to your family." She nodded. "I will." Her relatives gently guided her away, and Thomas watched as the group slowly walked back toward their village. Nayeli glanced over her shoulder once more and gave him a small wave. Thomas returned the gesture with a quiet smile. After they disappeared into the distance, Thomas stood alone on the trail for a while, letting the calm morning settle around him. The land felt different now. Not empty, not lonely, just quiet in a peaceful way. The cold breeze touched his face, but it no longer felt harsh. As he turned to walk back toward his cabin, Thomas felt a change inside him. The night before, he had been alone, as he had been for many years. But the unexpected visit from the Apache girl had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten, the feeling of helping someone simply because it was right, the feeling of connection that warmed even the coldest night. His cabin waited for him at the far edge of the land, standing small but strong in the morning light. When he reached it, he paused at the door and looked at the stove inside. The wood she had helped him prepare was neatly stacked. The tools she had arranged still lay in perfect order. It almost felt like she was still there. Thomas smiled to himself. "Safe travels, little one," he whispered softly. He stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. The cabin felt different now, not just a place of solitude, but a place where a small miracle had happened. One night, one stranger, one simple act of kindness, and everything felt a little warmer,